Are we staring at globalization's biggest turning point since the end of the Cold War? With Asia feeling the pain of Donald Trump's war against Iran, with steadfast U.S. allies like the Philippines forced to declare energy emergencies, there's the immediate chain reaction for the nations that manufacture, well, a good part of the stuff we buy here in the West. And then there's the boomerang effect for the rest of the planet. Will they ever see those allies to the United States in the same light again? What with a president who favors spheres of influence and one-on-one hard bargains to international rules and free trade, as so-called middle powers look for alliances that ease their dependence both on the U.S. for defense and China for goods, we'll hear from the French president currently on a tour of Japan and Korea. At the heart of it all is what literally fuels capitalism: energy. We'll ask about a comeback for coal in the short run, and in the long term, the forecast. Will the events of the past month dissuade efforts to delay or even roll back the switch to renewables? How to hedge against a world that right now seems awfully dependent on warring oil and gas suppliers. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about Asia's energy predicament and the impact on globalization. With us, she's been chronicling it throughout from the France 24 business desk. Yuka Royer, good to see you.
Hi, yeah.
With us as well, Thierry Broz, visiting professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
I'm okay. From Washington, Irfan Nuruddin, professor of Indian politics at Georgetown University. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And from Oman's capital, Muscat, energy and geopolitics analyst Dawood Ansari. Welcome to the show. You can always listen to the France 24 debate, by the way, wherever podcasts are streamed. Let's talk a little bit about Joseph Orinian. He's never seen anything like it in his 32 years of driving a jeepney through the streets of Manila. His spending on fuel has more than doubled to around 2,000 pesos a day. That's the equivalent of around $33. His plight mirrors that of his nation of 116 million citizens. The Philippines, for the first time in 5 years, importing Russian crude, even though it's a staunch U.S. ally. This after declaring an energy emergency.
This is the part also that's very painful. When you're driving back and that there are no passengers, the passengers that we got at the terminal, that's barely enough to pay for diesel. What's left is very little.
More than 90% of the Philippines' crude comes from the Middle East. Similar tale in South Korea, as Brian Quinn explains.
Drastic measures for dire circumstances. The South Korean government is proposing a new supplementary budget, its second in less than a year. President Lee Jae-myung seeking to shield his country's economy from the effects of war in Iran, while warning that weaning it off imported oil will be essential.
The latest war in the Middle East has made it clear that the energy transition, that is, the major shift to renewable energy, is no longer a national and historical task that can be postponed.
South Korea is the world's #4 oil importer. Some 70% of its supply comes from the Middle East, leaving it especially vulnerable to disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. The supplementary budget is calling for 26.2 trillion won, roughly 15 billion euros, in new spending. Among its measures are 5.75 billion euros to help offset high oil prices, including the cost of a nationwide fuel price cap, along with relief for low-income earners, companies affected by the conflict, and oil refiners. Consumer vouchers for the lower 70% of earners will cost some 2.7 billion euros. To pay for it, the government is planning to tap surplus tax revenue from the country's recent boom in chip exports and an accompanying stock market rally, much of which has been erased since the start of the war. Analysts are expecting the latest package to provide some limited support for growth, but say it could also add to inflationary pressures amid an increasingly uncertain economic outlook.
Thierry Broz, we're speaking ahead of Donald Trump's primetime address. If he says the war is over, problem solved, everybody goes home?
Problem partially solved. Price of oil will go slightly down, but I think Asia, like Europe, will remember this. And so we will have to think about how do we design our energy transition? Remember, we designed the energy transition in Europe with the aim of decarbonization, the first and I would say unique aim. Now it's going to be back to security of supply. And security of supply will change the overall system. As you said in your show just earlier, there will be a revival of coal, unfortunately.
All right, we'll talk about coal in a minute. Right now, though, countries like South Korea, like the Philippines, they're having to compete against India and China for what is trickling out. It kind of reminds us, Yuka Hwaye, of remember those scenes where there were the masks on the tarmac at the beginning of COVID, and
who gets the masks first?
Who gets the mask first, and the plane would go the other direction, going towards the highest bidder. Right now, these Asian nations all competing against one another?
I think they are going both ways. I think they are also trying to secure as much as possible what their domestic needs what they will need domestically. But at the same time, I think they are starting to look at other countries within Asia, for example, to secure supplies among each other. For instance, I think they're looking at longer-term cooperation when it comes to renewables. There's a move between Japan and South Korea taking leadership to forge new partnerships, for instance, for renewable energy development with Southeast Asian countries. So I think we're going to see sort of more countries trying to sort of seek new partnerships at the same time as, in a short run, securing their own energy needs.
All right. Donald Trump did not consult anyone, Dawood Ansari, when he launched his war. So I guess it's a question of who had the biggest stockpiles if we're looking at the short term?
It absolutely does. And Donald Trump has, in his most recent post, actually even said, well, America has the most of what you want. And that is not completely untrue. Indeed, it has been the US that, to a large extent, has even profited from previous crises, such as the Ukraine war and similar. And so, yes, the US is in a slightly more flexible and favorable position than many Asian economies are.
And are the stockpiles enough in these Far Eastern countries?
They absolutely are, and that's why, as you already mentioned, so we're seeing rationing, we're seeing trying to influence behavior, we're trying to see governments enacting new economic incentives to decrease consumption. So no situation that we have is completely incompatible with the demand that we've seen in previous years. And if things don't change very rapidly, then we're going to end the situation that effectively the economy that we've seen over the past years isn't able to be sustained.
Irfan Nuruddin, is a country like India in a better place because, well, they've got economy of scale and therefore they can bid for whatever's coming through?
Not really. India's problem is twofold. One is you just have a tremendous population in growing energy demand. And the second is that you're caught between a rock and a hard place geopolitically, of a dependence on Middle East oil and historically Russian oil that was also being sanctioned. So all your sources of oil are limited. The one thing in India's advantage is that for all of that growing energy need, India is still relatively a large population that does not have a very big energy footprint, but it is one that is very price sensitive. And so Mr. Modi is undoubtedly keeping a very careful eye on the cost of petrol because that ripples across the economy and is an early warning indicator of economic distress that is heavily felt by the poor and the middle class, and that is politically unsustainable in a democracy. So on the one hand, you don't have the kind of manufacturing needs that the East Asian countries have and that kind of demand for oil. A lot of the oil and the LPG that India needs is used for daily things like cooking and all of that, but the price of that is felt in some sense far more widely across the length and breadth of the country.
People are trying to come up with analogies from the past, those that are old enough to remember them. The oil crises, there were two of them in the 1970s. Is this unprecedented, what we're living through this past month?
The the word unprecedented has been used more in the last year and a half of Mr. Trump's second term than probably any time before. In some sense, there's always analogies. What I don't think has much precedence is the complete willing destruction of the global supply chain that underpins capitalism and the global economy for no obvious purpose, right? This was a war of choice by Trump in which he did not have a clear set of objectives, still does not have a clear set of objectives, choosing not to consult with any of his erstwhile partners, in fact, using it as an opportunity to further denigrate NATO. The UK left India in the cold after years of trying to build India up as a strategic partner for the United States. So this is unprecedented, in my opinion, as being an economic shock caused by a geopolitical decision by the global hegemon that nobody, including the Trump administration, to be quite honest, can articulate what it's supposed to achieve and whether or not it's getting any closer to achieving it. So in that regard, unprecedented. In terms of a temporary economic shock that reveals to us the fragility of this very elaborate global supply chain on which the economy works, we, as you pointed out, got a real taste of that with COVID. We got a taste of that with Ukraine and Russia. So in that sense, I think we've got a little more muscle memory about how to deal with the economics. We have no muscle memory about how to deal with what the implications are for the global order as we understand it or thought we understood it.
Yeah, Dawood Ansari, I'm going to turn to you on this because you're in Oman at the edge of the Arabian Peninsula, and taking a wrecking ball to global supply chains, the Gulf states were seen as sort of the reputation here as the epitome of what is stability. Are you going to be able to regain that once the fighting stops?
Well, let me point out. I am pretty certain that a lot of the commentary that people have raised, particularly concerning the UAE of, well, Dubai's dream bubble finally bursting, that's not going to be true, right? So definitely the Gulf states do remain as strong players in the region. They will also remain after this war has hopefully ceased. They will be very attractive place for investments, for migration and similar. Nonetheless, it is very important to realize that the Gulf states have been actively seeking FDIs over the past years, and they have been able to attract those FDIs, particularly because of the envisioned perfect stability, zero risk environment. And obviously, that is a factor that has definitely taken a hit here. So I would definitely see. So will tourism bounce back? Probably yes. Will the overall economy bounce back to a large degree? Yes. However, what might have been hit to a large extent are the strong expansion plans towards a new economy, to its attracting industry relocation towards the Gulf, and frankly, that is at the same time actually also where it hurts quite a lot. So I think, for instance, I mean, you need to give the Iranians at least the point that it's quite ironic that particularly data centers and AI hubs were chosen as targets of Iranian strikes, because that is exactly where many Gulf states chose to expand their economies into. And after the war has hopefully ended, yes, we will need to see how many companies are still willing to build data centers in the region.
All right, so the question, and that brings us to, again, what Irfan was mentioning a moment ago, perhaps the key term here, supply chains, when you're looking at the global economy. We've heard another day of contradictory statements from Washington, and you have countries like the Philippines and Malaysia trying to cut side deals with Iran to let their ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, whose parliament has approved a plan to effectively impose paperwork and fees for ships that cross through that strait, otherwise put, a toll booth. And a toll booth could beget others. Let's take a look at these are the big global choke points for maritime traffic. And by that we mean, of course, oil as well. And if you've got, Thierry Brosse, a toll to go through the Strait of Hormuz, why not for the Bab-el-Mandeb Canal? Why not for the Bosphorus Straits, where the oil comes from the Black Sea? Why not from the Strait of Gibraltar while we're at it?
Because it's supposed to be illegal. So if we were to look at international regulation, international law, it should be a free maritime passage. And so what Iran is doing is, I will quote the energy minister from the UAE, it's economical terrorism. They are trying to extract money. Unfortunately, to your question, it's not so expensive. What they are charging maybe something like $2 million, but it's $2 million for a ship that is carrying 2 million barrels. So it will be $1 extra. And maybe some people are going to accept this. And I think Iran is targeting this because Iran knows this could be a way to split the Europeans or the Western countries, because some will accept, as you said, and some will say, no, we don't want. And so there will be a difference.
Is this the beginning of pay-as-you-go global trade? And
at the end, as you said, it's the end of globalization. It's the deglobalization of the world, and Iran has taken the first step, unfortunately.
Is that how we should look at it? Irfan Nuruddin, how do Indians feel about this concept of, and where you're in the U.S., Americans feel about this concept of, again, toll booths for the major choke points of the world?
Well, I think for India right now, the toll booth is one opportunity to survive because India has historically pretty close relationships with Iran. These go back well before India was independent, historical partnerships between the two countries, and India has been one of the countries that has been given safe passage through it. So maybe toll booths are better than complete blockade, if you'll allow that, right? I mean, it's not ideal, but for those who can pay the toll, it gives you a chance to get relief. India is a side view of this. It's collateral damage. It was not a war it had a stake in. It was not consulted. It is suffering the costs of it. So to blame for India, I think the chance to make any progress in getting oil shipments through and to get shipping through is a good thing. I will take one issue with your colleague, since we are in a debate, is that I don't think this is the Iran taking the first step. At the end of the day, this is the United States taking the first step. And Iran is choosing, in a way that we would expect in a geoeconomic situation, to use the leverage points it has. I mean, do we really think if the war ends that Iran will want to continue the toll booth model, or would it see an opportunity to, it has asserted that it can have a real choke point on the Strait of Hormuz, allowing trade to go through would win a lot of global goodwill, if you would, and you let things go, but you've sent a signal, you attack us again and we can inflict pain on the global economy. I think the precedent being set over here is, in fact, that, we see once again just how vulnerable this entire elaborate global system is on very particular points. You mentioned several in your question to Professor Brose, but I mean, think about the Straits of Malacca. Right, if the Chinese decide that they can choke 23.2% of the global trade passing through their neck of the woods, that is catastrophic for the global economy. And I think the vulnerability being exposed over here is that for all of the systems we have built, some countries still continue to have really incredible influence over particular choke points in a way that the globe and the world simply hasn't accommodated yet.
And do you agree with Thierry Prost that this is the end of globalization as we've known it since the end of the Cold War?
I think we've, yes, but I would again date it maybe, we're doing a post-mortem rather than diagnosing it in real time. The arbitrary imposition of tariffs, the use of tariff threats to deal with other bilateral geopolitical issues by Mr. Trump, all of those were already beginning to undermine a rules-based order for globalization. So I think the idea of globalization as resting on a set of rails, carefully negotiated in a multilateral setting by lots of countries that saw this in their mutual advantage, that has been shattered. We have seen what one country, the country in fact that benefited the most from that globalization, now choosing, in a sense, to take its ball and go home because it no longer thinks it's winning, can do to that whole system. The question really is the rest of the world willing to pick up the slack that the Americans are going to leave behind? There's a vacuum of leadership. One possibility is that the whole thing falls apart. The other is that we start rebuilding globalization without the Americans and kind of invite the Americans to say, you're welcome to be part of it, but we can't allow you to simply destroy what took 80 years to build. I'm obviously an optimist. I want it to be the latter, but not the former.
All right, let's try to follow your optimistic streak here and talk about picking up the slack. Again, Asian powers are scrambling. Ahead of Emmanuel Macron, Indonesia's President Prabowo Subianto also visiting Japan and South Korea this week. While he was in Tokyo, the Reuters news agency reporting on possible barter trading. Jakarta could strike a deal to beef up supplies of liquefied natural gas to Tokyo in exchange for liquefied petroleum gas. That's essential for cooking fuel. That's according to the head of Indonesia's oil and gas regulator. Yuka Royer, we're back to bartering.
Well, I mean, it does seem...
And this is what you were alluding to earlier
about smaller powers that are trying to negotiate.
What the Canadian Prime Minister in Davos called middle powers.
Middle powers, yeah, not smaller powers, but middle powers trying to, yes, I mean, strike deals among each other. And it may be so in the sense that Japan relies a lot on LNG. About a third of its electricity comes from liquefied natural gas, whereas it doesn't rely so much on liquefied petroleum gas, which is needed as cooking oil in other countries, including Indonesia. And Indonesia was already an exporter of LNG to Japan, and it's not surprising that it's looking to boost its share of exports to Japan and perhaps elsewhere.
Now, we talked about the United States, as Irfan was saying earlier, picking up its ball and going home. What about China? Because we've seen there over the past month, they say, oh, we're open for business. But in practice, they've also done things like an export on, a ban export on jet fuel.
Jet fuel.
And that's hitting really hard countries like Vietnam.
Well, China is not... It portrayed itself, or it's been portraying itself more and more in recent years as a guarantor of the rule-based international order when it comes to trade. But at the same time, China is still not a member of the International Energy Agency, for instance. So it's not known exactly how much of crude oil it has in its own stockpiles, but it is reported...
It's talking it up in any case.
Yes, it's reported to have built up about 30 months' worth of crude oil to meet its...
But we don't know if that's true or not, Thierry?
No, this data is completely confidential, and China doesn't play with the IEA rules. And so, yes, we've released IEA stocks. Those stocks are small versus the global disorder. I mean, if you look at flows, because what matters is flows, is not the stock, it's the flows of the strategic stocks. It's 3 million barrels per day. The choke point that you mentioned is 20 million barrels per day. So you see, we are not going to mitigate the full crisis of this Hormuz closure. And China here is playing, but is not playing through our rules. And on top, as you said, there is this ban on export, which is going also to be to see the neighbors of China will not really rely on China. Because if you were expecting, like Vietnam, your jet fuel to fly your airplanes, now your airplanes are grounded.
Right. And so that's going to have an impact. The times of war, of course, sometimes call for drastic measures like a Kamehameha. The Japanese Prime Minister and the French President playfully alluding to iconic Japanese manga and video game franchise Dragon Ball, for those who know it, during their joint press conference earlier in the day. Emmanuel Macron also selling France and Europe as reliable and predictable allies.
Since 2018, we have pursued an Indo-Pacific strategy and have never deviated from this objective, which is to make this region a free space where sovereignty is fully respected by all, where no hegemony prevails, and which, in the areas of security, the economy and climate, allows us to act with all the countries of the region.
And the day was heavy with allusions to the United States. Yes, you got to explain to me Dragon Ball at some point. But heavy with allusions to the United States, both there in the joint presser with Prime Minister Takaichi, but also earlier when he spoke with French business leaders. Emmanuel Macron saying, look, We in Europe, it's slow, it's clunky, but we're stable, we're predictable. You can rely on us. How's that message going to go down?
It's still very far geographically. When it comes to goods trade or energy trade, for instance, Japan relies on almost 100% of its fossil fuel needs for imports from other countries, and almost none of that comes from Europe, for instance. Goods trade, yes, there is a significant amount, and there has been talks of expanded free trade and so forth, but it is still a distant continent, I think, when it comes to and even if America is also a distant continent, but it's been an ally in a true sense, whereas Europe has not been.
So the timing was wrong for this visit? It sounds a little bit like that, listening to you, Ken.
Well, I think it was, I would say maybe it won't be too wrong, because I would add, it's so far true. Because what happens if the crisis gets harder and each country is doing what China is doing? Because at some stage, some people will think, am I going to allow those exports to another richer country? Because remember, back in 2022 in Europe, we took the LNG away from those countries, not from Japan because it's rich, but when we had a crisis in gas, from Russian gas, we hiked the price and the LNG carriers came to us. So there may be a case later during the crisis where we may not be so nice to each other going down the road.
Yeah, Dawood Ansari, it's not the good middle powers and the evil superpowers?
In terms of the oil market itself and energy, absolutely isn't. Let's be frank, even looking back, I mean, again, as Irfan previously said, we're using the word unprecedented quite a lot. And even when looking back at the gas price crisis in 2022 and the Ukraine war, countries have been very cannibalistic and very have shown quite a predatory notion when it comes to buying up each other's contracts. Given how strongly spot market prices increase, there have actually even quite a number of cases where it's been lucrative for countries to forego their existing contractual obligations and instead sell to others simply because any penalty they might need to pay is less than the additional margin that other party is going to play. But I mean, drawing a bit back to the discussion you had earlier, is this the end of globalization? We'll probably more generally need to talk about how do energy markets look like in a more polycentric order. This is something we haven't really thought about yet, frankly.
And Irfan was saying earlier how he wants to see a world where those middle powers mitigate for this, for things like this, and learn to work with each other. How do you do that?
I mean, I would argue to a large extent they are already doing that. The big difference, perhaps, between what we're seeing now happening with middle powers and what we've seen in, say, the past century on major powers, is to some extent that middle powers tend to engage more in bilateral structures. That's a main difference, and so we're seeing more and more, especially in the Asian continent, these bilateral structures evolving. Be it in terms of the reason of supply chains, or be it also in terms of innovation networks. So a lot is happening on a bilateral basis.
More on a bilateral basis. Irfan Nuruddin. What's the recipe at a crisis moment like this, where, again, we're competing, as the panel has been saying, countries competing against one another for fuel. How do you get to that point where it's cooperation, not competition?
Two paths suggest themselves to me, right, neither of which is a silver bullet. One is, of course, the idea that crisis should never be wasted, and to the extent that you can use it, as one of your earlier segments suggested, to really spearhead renewable energy, to return to a notion that fossil fuels are not only just bad for the environment, but are fundamentally security risks because of how dependent most of the world is on very few countries to supply that. And now we're seeing it's not just the countries that supply it, it's the channels through which they supply it. If it can really bring us back to understanding that renewable energies are critical, not just as a good thing for the environment, but good for our economies, good for our security. That's a win. The other is I think we do have to figure out a different way in which states work with each other on a currency level. So two things struck me. You mentioned the barter a bit, but one of the other headlines that you flashed up early in the show talked about the trade happening in Chinese yuan, right? Part of the problem is that the dollarization of the global economy has been a real asset for globalization until we see it weaponized during the Ukraine-Russia war as a way of going after Russia. But the financial dependence of most countries on the dollar for international trade is a challenge in a world in which the US is no longer a reliable partner. So finding new rails on which countries at a bilateral level can work with each other, or at a plurilateral level can work with each other at a minilateral, right? Lots of laterals, but basically smaller groups of country, much more regional levels of trade. South Asia is home to 2.5 billion people of this planet and has the lowest intra-regional trade in the world, lower trade within the region than in all of sub-Saharan Africa, even though it's a much higher income level on average. Breaking down those regional barriers is consistent with supporting a truly robust global economy. But right now, because of the leadership of the United States, historically, we are focused very much on global deals. But frankly, the failure of the Doha round showed us that we haven't been able to do global deals for over 20 years. And we should stop thinking about bilateral trade agreements and plurilateral trade agreements as somehow being bad and start seeing them as the building blocks towards a more robust global economy.
And so you talk about a de-dollarization. Who's the winner if you de-dollarize?
So the obvious winner, if you don't do it correctly, is China, and then you just replace one with the other. Right? But the Chinese are not going to be willing to support a currency, a stable global reserve currency in the way that the United States has, nor will, frankly, most countries of the world want to give it that power. So this is what I meant by thinking about different rails, right? I mean, you mentioned barter, and your question to your colleague on the panel was, have we really gone back to barter systems? Except maybe we need to think about the barter system as being a pretty sophisticated arrangement to deal with a world in which access to foreign currency is a real choke point for many developing countries wanting to participate in globalization, right? So I'm not calling for de-dollarization. I'm just suggesting that in a world in which we are no longer in status quo, where the dollar could be relied on reliably, where the financial global system could not just be subjected to US sanctions against anyone that they don't care for in a particular minute, we have to think of other ways in which to protect globalization, which is fundamentally about letting goods and services and people travel across borders. And if that requires going back to barter, so be it. If it requires that we do it in local currency swaps, so be it. And if it requires that the yuan takes on a role, maybe we allow that as well. But we do have to find other ways to do it, because fundamentally, the Strait of Hormuz exposes both the Strait of Hormuz, but the war in Iran exposes that this entire system is very reliant on an America that is globally minded and willing to provide the public goods of global order. Mr. Trump has made very clear that he's not interested in that game. And I don't have a crystal ball to suggest that once he's out of power, that America returns to an America of the 1970s or 1960s. And so I think protecting globalization requires creativity, even if it means that solutions are in places we haven't had to look for in a long, long time.
All right, so piecemeal solutions, Thierry Brosse, not replacing the dollar with the yuan or the euro.
Oh, the euro. I mean, I was thinking when I was listening here, I mean, Europe is trying to do those things. We've tried to put all our countries...
to replace the dollar by the euro?
To try to put all our countries together. And it's a very, very difficult task. And it takes a very, very long time. So changing the global order for something else will take a very, very long time. And I think we may go into the barter or the improved barter system because countries will look at themselves first, and because energy is the first element in terms of sovereignty, and so they will review the whole thing differently from now.
How will they review it?
Well, they will review it by saying what is secure, what am I doing here? And so what I'm doing in my country or in my neighbor may be better than getting it miles away, as you said, far away.
So you're talking about an electrification of the economy, because not everybody has oil and gas.
No, it can be coal, you're right. It can be nuclear, it can be renewable, but it will be something where, can I do this close to my place? And if not, then what is the trade-off? But I think it may be a not very good scenario for climate. It may be a bit dystopian because there may be more coal coming.
Yeah, coal, which is certainly making a comeback, or rather, as the Financial Times reports this Wednesday, kind of never went away. India still gets nearly 75% of its electricity from coal. China nearly 58%. Dawood Ansari, were you staring at a momentary blip where the carbon footprint will go up in the short run, but then dip in the longer as we push more towards renewables, towards nuclear power? Or are hydrocarbons going to come back with a vengeance under a different form?
Let me try to give a balanced answer to that. So, as you mentioned, definitely in the short run, we're going to see an uptick of coal, and that does not only include Asia, particularly also Europe. I think of Germany particularly. So a lot of those countries that supposedly phased out coal, they're going to bring coal back. However, perhaps in a rather short-term fashion. And the main reason for that is that in many of those cases, particularly outside of Asia, coal is also from an economic point of view simply not efficient anymore and so far. When it comes to the mid-run, however, and I've been closely following the balancing points that Thierry has raised on. Well, if we're in times of war, then people are always very quick to say that well, we're going to be ready to pay a premium for, let it be diversification. We're going to pay a premium for new technologies. And yes, while you're at war, we're always very keen to say that. But once things cool down, we're then back to a world that is rather thinking in terms of least cost and efficiency than in terms of preparing and anticipating for the biggest risks possible. So are renewable energies going to profit from this crisis? Yes, definitely. But I'm very skeptical as to whether this crisis is going to bring an end or a meaningful disruption to the use of hydrocarbons.
In the last 6 months, Yuko, we've seen major car companies give up on a switch to all electric or hybrid and electric, some of them.
That trend had already started before the war in Iran.
No, but I say in the last 6 months in particular, we saw this trend. Now with the war in Iran, do you change it all back again?
It would take time, and probably, they won't roll back completely on electrification. I think electrification, most agree that it is the way forward. It might slow down that process.
Because as Dawood said, everybody liked it if it was cheap, and there were subsidies for a while.
But no, and coal, but thinking of coal, I certainly hope that it is, as you said, a temporary blip in the system, that there would be, in the short run, a surge in demand for coal, because there is no alternative so far, apart from countries like China, which already has ample supplies from alternative energy sources. But again, in countries, its neighbor, Japan, for instance, coal already accounted for nearly a quarter of its power generation back in 2024, and that's because of...
Is Japan now in the same boat as Germany, where they're thinking about reopening those nuclear power plants?
It has already been slowly trying to restart its fleet of its nuclear reactors. It has been, but because of the 2011 Fukushima disaster, it is very difficult to convince the population, that it is safe to do so. And there is still that question that remains. President Macron was also selling France's nuclear technology. He's pushing for the next generation nuclear reactors, the small module nuclear reactors. And I think that Japan is open to that idea, but it is it's one thing to be realistic and start looking at nuclear technology once again, but it is quite another to convince the nation that it's still reeling from the disaster.
Thierry Bros?
Yeah, I think coal will come with the revenge because it's cheap and it's local. And please remember that when you open a coal mine, it's going to be there for 40 years. So everybody that is opening a coal mine in India, in China, or any other place, it's going to be dead cheap for many, many years. So I think we are going into a dystopian scenario where we are going, unfortunately, to see more coal. And this coal will replace the gas and the oil infrastructure that have been slightly destroyed. So there will be this intake, you're right, for nuclear, but nuclear won't happen before the next 10 years. So the real question for those countries is, are we engaging in a nuclear program like France in the 70s? So I think it can be the French moment worldwide. This is what Macron should sell. We've done this in the 70s, and we are way better off today. We are immune to this crisis on the electricity sector. And we are one of the only countries that can show this to the world.
Irfan Nuruddin, yes, again, there's 3/4 of electricity production in India, which is coal-powered. But at the same time, the government now imposing sustainability goals. We're seeing that there's this sort of breaking point there, particularly when you happen to be in Delhi during smog season, kind of like where China was a decade ago.
Yeah, the environmental damage done to Indian cities is a disaster that I think we need far more attention on, and I appreciate you mentioning smog season. I think there is still a real question as to whether that consciousness of air pollution and environmental damage has any electoral costs for politicians in a way that allows prime ministers to talk about moving India.
All right, seem to have lost the video link there with Washington. We'll try to reconnect as quickly as we can with Irfan Nuruddin from DC. You're back, Irfan. You're back. One final question for you, because today's April 1st. It's the 50th anniversary of Apple. And again, this is, we talk about globalization on this show. This is an example, right? The ideas for the concept originated in Japan. The company is founded in California. They make the iPhones in China. Now those iPhones are being made more and more, 25% of them in India. This model of globalization, does it still have a long future ahead of it?
I believe it does. You can't unshut good ideas. And I think we've seen the greatest increase in human well-being, human income in the last 1,000 years has occurred in the last 100. And it is largely because of the growth of global trade and globalization, of allowing the productivity gains to be spread. The distribution of those gains has been incredibly unequal and uneven. And so preserving the golden goose of globalization does require some choices and some very deliberate, intentional decisions about how to make sure that the environmental damage and costs are not excessive, how to make sure that inequality doesn't grow rapidly, and of course, how to make it sustainable in a world in which, for all of that incredible technology, those Apple phones still have to pass through the Suez Canal, still have to pass through the Straits of Malacca, because that is still the quickest way in which to get them to the markets in which consumers are going to buy them. So we've built something really incredibly powerful. In some ways, the next 100 years was never going to be built on the backs of the globalization system that worked in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. So if this forces us to reinvent it, that in the long run, maybe it's not a bad thing. If it makes us go back to our silos and say, our country, and we don't care about the rest of it, that would truly be a tragedy, and we'll regret this for a long time to come.
All right, it could still be a small world after all, says Irfan Nuruddin. Many thanks for being with us from Washington. I want to thank Dawood Ansari joining our conversation from Muscat, Thierry Bros, Yuka Royer. A reminder, You can watch Donald Trump's first primetime remarks on the war in Iran live here on France 24. That's at 3 a.m. Paris time, 9 p.m. Washington time. Thanks for being with us here in the France 24 debate.